Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. Today, my partner in crime, Sam Wong, can't join us. Many observers have been extremely troubled by the fact that in many states right now, we have seen the imposition of restrictions on voting based on allegations of voter fraud that have not been substantiated by most accounts with any evidence. In a number of states like Texas, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, there are fears about what kind of impact these restrictions will have and whether we are watching the disenfranchisement of certain voters throughout the country. And it's hard to believe, I think, in 2016 that this is the kind of story we'd be talking about after over a century where there's been an effort to expand the vote. So I couldn't think of a better guest to join us today than Ari Berman. Ari's a senior contributing writer for The Nation and a fellow at the Nation Institute. His most recent book is called Us the Ballot, A Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, which is published by FSG and available online and at all bookstores. It's a very provocative book about the drive that started in the 1970s against voting rights in response to the historic voting rights legislation of 1965. It's also published in the New York Times, The Guardian, Rolling Stone. He appears on MSNBC and NPR, and he's really become one of the most important voices covering this issue. So welcome to Politics and Polls, Ari.
Hey, Julian. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Thank you for having me at Princeton. Thank you for blurbing my book.
Pleasure. And it's been fun to have this conversation over many months now. I've learned a lot reading and following this. Could you maybe just start with what you talk about in the book? What has been the driving force behind these voter ID laws that we have seen pop up all over the country?
Sure. So basically, I think that there's a very old strategy in American politics, as you know, which is if you don't feel like you can win someone's vote, suppress their vote instead. And we've seen that throughout American history. And we saw that after the Civil War, when there was all of these African Americans who were enfranchised during Reconstruction, we then saw a vicious backlash and we got things like poll taxes and literacy tests and all white primaries and all of those things. And I think the hope was that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 would end this debate over voting rights once and for all. But it didn't end the debate over voting rights. It led to new strategies to try to counteract the power of these emerging constituencies that were enfranchised, whether it was African Americans or Latinos or younger people. And what we saw is that following the election of the first black president, there was a similar backlash, that we had seen a few voter ID laws begin percolating before 2008. But really after 2008, they exploded all across the country. And I think the basic idea behind them was, let's try to figure out a way to make the electorate older, whiter, and more conservative, as opposed to younger, more diverse, and more progressive, like it had been in 2008.
And how much of this effort was about race, directly about race, and how much was it partisan? Was it purely an effort to overturn gains that Democrats had made or might make in coming years?
I think it was more about partisanship, but partisanship and race are so intertwined here because you have a situation where the Republican Party is virtually all white and the Democratic Party is very diverse, and in particular, black voters are the core of the Democratic Party. And so one Republican consultant said, well, if African Americans were voting for Republicans, then Republicans wouldn't be suppressing the vote. But African Americans aren't voting for Republicans. And so I think that Republicans are trying to gain a political advantage here. So I think it's more about partisanship. But I don't think we can ignore the fact that some people throughout American history have been disenfranchised and targeted over and over. And I think it's disturbing to see that African Americans, Latinos, other voters of color are being targeted by these efforts, because I see lots of parallels in terms of how these kind of constituencies were targeted in the past.
Is this a national effort? Is it the Republican National Committee? Has this taken place, or this local politics in the different states? How is this? Who's doing it?
I think it's really been driven by the states, but with national coordination, because you're not suddenly going to get a situation where Pennsylvania and Texas and Wisconsin are all doing the same thing without someone helping to coordinate it. So in a lot of ways, what we're seeing on voting is similar to what we saw, for example, on abortion, which is they introduce all of this legislation to make it effectively impossible to run an abortion clinic, all of these ridiculous regulations. And I don't think we're at the same place with voting. It's not like they're making it impossible for voting. They're just trying to find all of these ways to make it more difficult. So requiring strict forms of ID that you never needed before, or making it harder to register to vote, or cutting back on the amount of time that people have to vote. This isn't going to knock everyone out of the process, but it might shave 1, 2, 3, 4 points. And then you're talking about it in a close election having a really big benefit.
And how do the voter restriction laws that are being put into place today compare with the kinds of laws that were put into place in the Jim Crow era?
Well, the Jim Crow laws were certainly more restrictive. But remember, the Jim Crow laws, except for things like all-white primaries, didn't really mention race either. Like, literacy tests and poll taxes were officially race neutral, but everyone knew that most white voters were never going to be asked to pay a poll tax or given a literacy test. And so I think it's sort of the same kind of thing where people say, well, what's the big deal with voter ID? Doesn't everyone have voter ID? But the data shows that there are real racial disparities here, that lower income individuals are more impacted by these things, that we know from the data that African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to live in poverty, that they're more likely to live in urban areas, that they're more likely to not drive and rely on public transportation. So for all of these reasons, they would be less likely to have ID than other people. They move more. Same with younger people. Younger people are being told that their student IDs aren't acceptable, or they can't vote where their dorms are, or things like that. So on the face of it, it seems like this is a neutral thing, but it's clearly targeting some voters more than others. So I would say the effort's more subtle than Jim Crow. It's not fair to say it's just a resurrection of Jim Crow, but I also think it's a little disingenuous to say there's no parallels either, because I clearly see some of these things as new iteration. I know, for example, with voter ID laws, people often have to pay for underlying documents they need to get IDs. They need to pay for birth certificates or naturalization papers or things like that. And that costs money. And that's why different courts have called voter ID laws a modern day poll tax, for example.
And so with Jim Crow, historians who look at it always talk about how it also affected lower class white Americans. It had a class basis too. Is that something that might happen right now as we see the effect of this, or will it have a different kind of effect?
I think there's a little bit of that effect. I mean, I think it's possible that Republicans are disenfranchising some of their own voters as well, that they're disenfranchising some low-income whites, that they're disenfranchising some elderly voters. I think elderly voters in particular have problems with voter ID laws because they don't drive anymore. Mm-hmm. A lot of them don't have valid driver's licenses, and they have a hard time getting IDs. So I've definitely talked to elderly white women, some of whom vote Republican, who have been disenfranchised by these laws. But I have been struck that over and over and over, the people that I'm hearing from who are most impacted by these things tend to be voters of color that are trapped in a number of different instances.
And do you think this is going to have an effect on Latino voters? Obviously, one of the big questions with Trump, given his rhetoric and stance on immigration, is how much will this cost the GOP votes? And countervailing part of the story is what impact might these laws have on depressing the Latino vote, which is already, from what I understand, a little lower than other social groups. Well, is this going to be a story in certain states?
Yeah, I think so. You look at a place like Texas, Latinos in Texas were even more likely than African Americans to not have voter ID. They were more likely to live below the poverty line. They were more likely to not drive. They were more likely to live in counties that didn't even have a DMV office to begin with. The research by social scientists shows that blacks and Latinos are pretty much equally affected by these kind of things. So I think that the impact on the Latino vote often gets overlooked, but it's there. I think also a lot of the rhetoric that we hear about voter fraud these days from Republicans is directed at the Latino community. When people say that undocumented immigrants are coming over here to vote, which is a completely absurd hypothetical. The last thing that someone who's undocumented would want to do is risk a felony and deportation. But nonetheless, a lot of the rhetoric I hear is actually based, I think, on demonizing Latinos and this idea that somehow anti-immigrant fervor has extended to voter fraud. It's become kind of a toxic combination on the right.
Is there evidence of voter fraud? That's the basis of the laws.
There's very little evidence of voter fraud. No one would have looked at the 2008 election and said, oh, well, there was all of this voter fraud here that we then needed to build all of this new restrictive legislation. And in particular, voter impersonation, which is the kind of thing that a voter ID law would stop, is exceedingly rare. That according to national studies, there have been a billion votes cast since 2000, but only 31 cases of voter impersonation. And that's because it's a really stupid and inefficient way to try to steal an election. If you show up in person, if I show up and say I'm Julian Zelizer more than once, I'm going to get caught. We all vote in most states at the same one precinct. We're assigned to that precinct. We already have to give, we have to give our name, we have to give our address. So, I mean, for someone to do this on a big level is really hard to pull off. If you voted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, it's very likely you're going to get caught by the time you do it the 5th time. You're going to get hit with a felony. You're going to get hit with a fine. And so I really think the risks here aren't really worth the reward. And so I think this whole movement that talks about voter fraud, to me, is really a manufactured crisis.
And why does it gain strength? Why do you think that's a remarkably low number of cases to change laws across the state. So what is causing public support, not just political support for this?
Well, I think that, number one, this has been repeated over and over on the right. So, I mean, Fox News has covered manufactured scandals like the new Black Panther Party ad nauseum. They blew the Acorn scandal totally out of proportion. Acorn, the voter registration group, did some bad things, but they were never committing the kind of voter fraud that they were accused of. And it just gets repeated over and over and over again.
What was the video on that? I don't even remember.
James O'Keefe, the conservative activist, went undercover and tried to solicit a prostitute or something, but it was all taken out of context. The videos were all edited, and even people that were registered improperly, none of them actually voted. It's one thing to make up someone who registered, but another thing to actually have that person to vote. That just doesn't happen. And so I think basically, Fox News, Breitbart, all of these organs that we now see were instrumental in Trump's rise, have been instrumental in pushing the voter fraud narrative. And I think obviously when it comes to voter ID laws, 90% of the public has correct voter ID. 90% of the public has a driver's license. So they think, what's the big deal? So it's always going to be hard to message against something that only 10% of Americans don't have. I think so. Voter ID laws remain popular, but other things like cutting early voting, shutting down voter registration drives, when states have done that, that's very unpopular. And so that's why I try to talk about this more broadly. It's not just that you're required for ID. It's that there's all of these other things that are being done to make it harder to vote. Like when there were 7-hour lines in Florida in 2012 because they cut early voting. Trust me, that was very, very unpopular in the state.
Yeah, and the IDs probably symbolically are easier to sell politically. It's not simply that it affects different groups, but the voter ID is just a tangible storyline that everyone would agree. You want to know who's voting and who's not, and then you can use that to spin a story of all these people who are somehow trying to infiltrate local voting booth.
Yeah, and what we see is that states have gone beyond voter ID. So North Carolina passed this sweeping rewrite of its election laws, and they didn't just require voter ID, but they eliminated same-day voter registration. They cut early voting, and some of those things actually mattered more than voter ID. Mm-hmm. Like if you talk to people in North Carolina, same-day voter registration was the most important thing for them. The ability that during the early voting period they could register people to vote at the polls was huge, particularly for college students, particularly for people who move. So many people move into a state like North Carolina from New York and other states that the ability to register them at the polls was huge. So the voter ID thing got all the attention. But some of the other stuff, some of the other restrictions that were buried in the law were even more consequential.
And what's the justification for ending early voting? That doesn't seem that it would be a fraud-based argument that you could even spin on that. Why? How did they sell that?
It has nothing to do with voter fraud. I mean, giving people more time to vote. Yeah. If anything, it would lead to less voter fraud because there's more time to monitor the polls and things are less chaotic on Election Day. Basically, what they said was some counties are using this more than others. It's too expensive for the rural counties to administer early voting. Not enough people are voting during those days. But this was all about, in a place like North Carolina, the fact that there was large early voting turnouts in cities that lean Democratic, like Charlotte, like the Triangle. In Wisconsin, they cut early voting. It was clearly being used much more in Madison and Milwaukee. Actually, the author of the bill to reduce early voting in Wisconsin said that he wanted to nip early voting in the bud before it spread from places like Milwaukee and Madison to other parts of the state. So I think people have been pretty transparent about the rationale here. It was interesting. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in North Carolina asked the state, well, why did you cut early voting? Why did you eliminate voting on the Sunday before the election, which is when black churches do souls to the polls voter mobilization drives? And the state said, well, it was used in some counties more than others. And the court said, well, which counties was it used more in? And the state said, well, it was used more in counties with large African-American populations that voted more Democratic.
Uh-huh.
And the court said, are you kidding me? You just admitted that you did this for discriminatory and partisan reasons. And then they said this evidence was as close to a smoking gun as you're going to see in modern times.
And how important? So some of this comes before the Supreme Court decision overturning some of the Voting Rights Act. But then how much of an effect did that decision have on what you're talking about in the states?
So the contemporary effort to make it harder to vote really occurred after the 2010 election, when Republicans gained these big legislative majorities all across the country, and really important states like Ohio and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania flipped to the GOP. And that's when I first started covering attacks on voting rights. But the gutting of the Voting Rights Act was basically a really strong steroid to existing voter suppression efforts. Like, imagine you have like Barry Bonds, and then Barry Bonds on steroids. That's kind of like Barry Bonds was a good hitter before he took steroids, but he wasn't the home run champion, And right. Now that's kind of like what happened. They were already doing these efforts, and then once the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, it made it much, much easier for them to implement restrictive voting laws in places like North Carolina and Texas, because those states no longer had to get federal approval. So before, they would have had to approve all of these voting changes with the federal government. We already saw that laws like Texas's voter ID law were blocked. Lots of states held off on submitting things to the federal government until after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, and then they just could just do it. No federal oversight. They could only be sued after the fact, and these lawsuits were very expensive and very difficult and time-consuming to organize.
And the court said that the Voting Rights Act, the part they knocked down, was no longer necessary, even though some of this was already taking place. So,
yeah, it was this very strange disconnect where I sat in on the oral arguments and then obviously covered the aftermath of the Shelby County versus Holder case, and you had John Roberts and all of these conservatives on the court talking about how much progress America had made. And I had just covered a 2012 election, which there was voter suppression efforts all across the country. And so you think, if anything, the courts would have looked and said, maybe we need more voting rights protections, not less, to try to encapsulate some of these northern states that are doing these things like Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania. But instead they said, it's not fair. You can't pick on the South anymore. You can't rely on data from the 1960s. But I think that basically this wasn't about empirical evidence. I think it was about the fact that, as I write in my book, people like John Roberts had been trying to gut the Voting Rights Act for decades. These were people who were revolutionaries in the Reagan administration.
Before he was on the court.
John Roberts had been working against the Voting Rights Act ever since he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department. Antonin Scalia was against the Voting Rights Act and things like it when he was a law professor in the 1970s, and then when Ronald Reagan appointed him to the bench. These guys had very long records here, and I don't think it was like suddenly they woke up one day and decided they didn't like the Voting Rights Act. They had been trying to weaken this law for decades, and I think they basically had a belief that government solutions to discrimination are as bad as the original sin of discrimination, and that they believe that not just about the Voting Rights Act, but about things like affirmative action and integrated schools and fair housing and all of these other things, that really John Roberts, the late Justice Scalia, Justice Alito, they've never been on board with these kind of remedies.
Are there any Democratic states under the control of Democrats where you're seeing any of this, or is it absent from?
Very little. The only state the only Democratic-controlled state that passed even a moderately strict voter ID law was Rhode Island, which kind of unclear. Rhode Island does not have the most progressive election laws, and it's a little bit of a strange state. It's very blue, but it's not that progressive. There may have been some racial politics going on there, but generally speaking, this has not been done by Democrats. Upwards of 85% of the states that have done this have been under Republican control.
Are there Republicans who challenge this strategy? Meaning, maybe in the short term in some states this is a good idea just politically, but in the long term you want to get more voters. And this could actually come back. Or is that not an argument in Republican circles?
The Republican Party has been remarkably silent on criticizing these issues. I always find it amazing that they keep trying to diagnose how someone like Trump became the nominee without actually thinking that, hey, maybe things like suppressing the vote created a toxic atmosphere in the Republican Party that led to someone like Trump being nominated. That the idea that you would try to keep people from voting is the exact kind of ideology to me that would give rise to someone like Trump. There have been some Republicans that have been critical of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. For example, Wisconsin Republican Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner was chairman of the House Judiciary Committee when the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized last in 2006, and he's been critical of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. He wrote a pretty remarkable op-ed in the New York Times back in March when he said, "I'd rather lose my job than suppress votes to keep it." And you just don't hear that kind of rhetoric at all from most Republicans.
It's funny because Republicans for a while were very proud of the Voting Rights Act, given Everett Dirksen's role in it.
Well, as you know, the Republican Party was just as important to the passage of the Voting Rights Act as the Democratic Party. This wasn't like this was just something that Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats did. It was not just Everett Dirksen, but you had for many years Republican committee chairmen that supported things like the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was reauthorized 4 times. And each reauthorization was signed by a Republican president. Now, I don't think any of those Republican presidents were that crazy about the Voting Rights Act, but the point is in Congress, there was very strong bipartisan support. I think genuine bipartisan support. And I think someone like Jim Sensenbrenner, who's been in Congress a long time, is a throwback to an era when Republicans believed in things like voting rights. And I think as the parties have become both more regionally and racially polarized. So basically, you have a situation where blacks and Hispanics are voting overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. Northern Republicans have basically been wiped out. So the Republican Party is a much more Southern party than it was even 10, 15 years ago. And it's much more conservative than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And so it's just impossible to imagine a situation where the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized by a vote of 98-0 in the Senate and 390-33 in the House like it was in 2006 with George W. Bush as president.
And then going into the current election, can you walk us through a few of the states we should be keeping our eyes out to see how these voting rights laws play out, and any states where you think it might make a difference?
So I think one state I've been paying a lot of attention to is Wisconsin, just because they have one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country, but also my reporting and others have found that basically not only is it one of the strictest laws, but the DMV has been totally inadequate in getting people voter IDs, that people over and over are showing up and they're being told that they can't get IDs for voting, even though the state keeps claiming in court that they're doing this. So there's a huge disconnect between what the state is claiming and what the impact on the ground is. So I'm concerned about that state. Another perennial state where there's always problems is Ohio. About 1 million people were purged from the voting rolls in Ohio. A court said that they needed to be back on the rolls, but voter registration in Ohio ended October 11th. So it's unclear if all of these people who were purged and then reinstated were even put back on the voting rolls. So that's another problematic thing. There are states like Texas where strict voter ID laws have been relaxed, so you don't need as strict forms of ID, but we'll see how that's actually implemented on the ground. I think there's a potential, again, for confusion, intimidation, potentially prosecution after the election if people don't follow the rules exactly as they're told. So I think there's going to be a lot of issues. 14 states have new voting restrictions in place for the first time in 2016, and some of them are important swing states like Wisconsin and Ohio, and some of them are redder states like Texas or Alabama. In my view, whether or not these things impact the election is the wrong way to look at them. I think the question is, why are we making it harder for people to vote once again in this country, absent a very compelling reason? And so in some cases, the most flagrant abuses are in states that aren't competitive, like Alabama and Mississippi, but have the worst history when it comes to voting rights. And you look at states that really embodied Jim Crow. And the fact that they are now going back and trying to figure out new ways to make it harder for people to vote, to me is just really disturbing. So I wish sometimes it wasn't viewed so much through the lens of partisan politics, as this is just really, really wrong given our history that this is still happening.
It's a moral issue.
I think it's a
simply
moral
partisan.
issue.
Right. And that's how it was framed in the 60s when the legislation was pushed through. That became very important.
I think when LBJ gave that famous speech introducing the Voting Rights Act where he said, "We shall overcome," that really was a moral speech, as you know. He wasn't making an argument for the Democratic Party. He wasn't just making an argument for the civil rights movement. He was basically saying that America could not be the America that it wanted to be as long as people were disenfranchised and beaten just for trying to get the right to vote. And so I think he was making, in some ways, an incredible appeal to American exceptionalism and saying America couldn't be exceptional as long as these kind of things were going on in the Jim Crow South.
And are you worried about what might happen in Pennsylvania with all the discussion of I can't remember what Trump has called them, the monitors?
He said, his election observers to stop crooked Hillary is what he's calling them.
And what does he mean by that? Do you know? Or how are people responding to that?
Well, so he's made lots of provocative comments. Every time he goes to Pennsylvania, it seems like this is where he's doing it the most. And he's saying, well, we need to watch certain areas, certain communities, which, it's not even really a dog whistle because it's not a whistle. It's more of a yell in terms of he's clearly talking about places like black voters in Philadelphia. He's even called on law enforcement to monitor the polls, which is illegal under Pennsylvania law. Law enforcement can't go into the polls and monitor. And it's also illegal according to a consent decree that was filed against the Republican Party for doing this exact kind of thing back in the 1980s in New Jersey. The one thing that I'm hopeful for is the Trump campaign is so disorganized. I'm not sure they're actually going to pull off what they're claiming. But certainly, if you got a bunch of angry Trump supporters who aren't that crazy about immigrants, aren't that crazy about people of color, are virtually all white, and they start showing up in places like Pittsburgh and Philly, that's not going to end well.
Why in Pennsylvania? Is that the state he's doing this in? Do you know?
I think because he's convinced that elections have been stolen in Pennsylvania by African Americans voting illegitimately for Democrats. I think he just believes that Pennsylvania kind of embodies this. And, you had the new Black Panther thing. And it's kind of one of those places where voting is so racially polarized that he's kind of made this his crusade. But he's talked about it elsewhere. He's talked about it in North Carolina and in Florida and in Ohio. But yeah, there is something. He said he went to college there, so he knows what he's talking about.
I see. So that's the Penn experience.
When he was at Penn, he noticed lots of examples of voter fraud, evidently.
And one more practical issue that I was thinking of. The people who work at the elections are going to be front and center, and they have been front and center in implementing this. Not the early voting, but the voter ID. How's that worked out so far?
Well, what we've seen across the country is that people have not been well trained and well versed in these changes. The people that work the polls tend to work the polls for a long time. So they tend to have been poll workers for decades, and they're not used to change. They don't really embrace change in a lot of cases. And so I think these are well-meaning people, but they're often not totally up to date on how the laws change. So all they know is maybe you need to have ID. They don't know, well, if you don't have ID, can you sign a regular ballot? Can you cast a provisional ballot? Do you need to sign, an affidavit? These are complicated things. Even I, who cover this stuff full-time, have trouble keeping up with some of the nuances of every state. So you can imagine how confusing it is, first for poll workers and then for voters. I think most voters are not election junkies like you or me. And so when the law changes and things become more restrictive, it's very, very confusing and burdensome for a lot of people.
And in some of these places, they're simply overwhelmed. All of us who remember the 2000 election and heard stories, or 2004 and since, the workers just, if everything was clean and everything was simple, in parts of these states, especially in cities, are overwhelmed with the number of people. And I imagine that could happen this time. So then you add to it their decision-making needs.
Yeah.
It could spell trouble.
Well, and little things have a big impact, like the number of polling places and the number of voting machines.
Yeah.
Those things can have a bigger impact than almost anything. In the Arizona primary, when there were 5-hour lines in Phoenix, that occurred because they cut 70% of polling places. And nobody knew about it until the primary. I didn't know about it until 9 p.m. that night when reports started coming in on Twitter. I mean, and I cover this for a living, and nobody tipped me off. So, I mean, sometimes I'm worried about that we're just going to show up on election day and polling places have been moved, things like that have been done, and nobody knew about it. In Ohio in 2004, when there were such long lines, it was because there weren't enough voting machines in places like Cincinnati and Columbus. And we'd like to hope history won't repeat itself. But again, we didn't really know this was going to be a problem until it was a problem. And so there's both the laws themselves that could have a big impact, but then there's all these things that are basically deal with like how resources are allocated that could also have a big impact.
And we're almost out of time, but hopefully we have some more optimistic news. What's the outlook for legislation? I know there was legislation being discussed to reinstate the Voting Rights Act and to strengthen it. Where is that, and how does it look?
Well, there is legislation in Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act. It hasn't moved because the Republican leadership hasn't moved on it. And I think if you had a Democratic Congress, they would pass this. So the groundwork has been laid within the Democratic Party to pass it. It just hasn't become a priority for the Republican Party, who aren't moving on anything, including things like immigration reform that have lots of Republican support. The states have really become the incubators of change here. The few states that are under Democratic control have been moving more aggressively. So like in Oregon right now, they have automatic voter registration. So when you go to get a driver's license or a state ID, you're automatically registered to vote in Oregon. You don't have to do anything other than the state confirming your citizenship and eligibility, and then they'll register you. So they're projecting that they're going to register 95% of Oregonians this way. And that's going to have a huge impact because then they mail everyone their ballots. It's a vote-by-mail state, and you start expanding the electorate. And to me, that's something that Democrats should be pushing for, and people who care about voting should be pushing for everywhere, because I think that the only way to try to sort of counteract efforts to make it harder to vote is to start trying to think of more innovative ways to bring more people into the political process.
And if that federal legislation, whatever is in it, passes, if somehow the Democrats took control, Democratic president passes, what would it do?
It would require basically states that have more recent voting rights violations to once again have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. It would also create a mechanism for states that are discriminating more recently to be covered. So it would take the worst actors and cover them once again. And it would also create a deterrent to some of these states that are currently discriminating that wouldn't be covered to say, if you keep doing this, you're going to get covered too. And so I think it would have an impact. I don't think it would stop voting discrimination altogether, but it would certainly be a powerful check on states like Texas and North Carolina and Georgia that just over and over and over are having issues with voting rights.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I do hold this as one of the big issues in the election that really goes beyond the election. It goes beyond the Trump-Clinton contest, and not enough people are paying attention because it gets to the the basis of our democracy. And as I started by saying, it's kind of remarkable we're having this discussion, or we're always telling people to vote, and yet you're telling this story through your book and through your reporting about how in some states we're doing the opposite. So I think it's an important issue to follow.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate you having me, Julian.
Once again, Ari Berman's new book is Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, published by FSG, available online and at bookstores, and you could read him regularly in The Nation, and I urge you to do so. That wraps up our episode, so thanks for joining us, and Sam and I will be back on Politics and Polls.
You've been listening to Politics and Polls, a podcast series about the 2016 presidential election produced by WooCast. The content discussed in this podcast is intended to be informational only. It does not represent nor reflect the views of Princeton University or the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.